In the early hours of the 13th of May, 1968, Australian soldiers were fighting for their lives in an area of operations they had never seen before, with maps their own artillery officers had already described as too inaccurate for detailed work. Their fire support base was still being dug when the North Vietnamese army arrived in regimental strength at 3:30 in the morning. The defenses were incomplete. The orders had been delivered largely by word of mouth. The commander had departed on scheduled leave the previous day. The Australians held. Then they pushed back. Then, over 26 days, they dominated terrain that belonged to somebody else's war, using methods that no map could document and no formal planning document could replicate. Tell me in the comments, had you heard of the Battle of Coral Balmoral before today? Because what you are about to discover is why the most decorated special operations veteran in the Vietnam era, United States Navy, said he learned more about warfare in 10 days with Australian soldiers than in every military school he ever attended combined. And why the maps, as it turned out, had nothing to do with it. The decision that placed Australian soldiers in that jungle had been made 3 years earlier, in a different capital, for reasons that mixed genuine strategic calculation with alliance obligation, measured in treaty language and Cold War anxiety. On the 29th of April, 1965, Prime Minister Sir Robert Menzies rose in the House of Representatives to announce that Australia would deploy an infantry battalion to South Vietnam in response to a request from the government of the Republic of Vietnam and in consultation with the United States. The ANZUS Treaty of 1951 had created a mutual defense arrangement between Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, and in the mid-1960s, that arrangement carried the weight of a region-wide ideological contest. Vietnam, in the Menzies government's assessment, was the front line of the Cold War in Asia. Holding it mattered. The leader of the opposition, Arthur Calwell, rose in response with a warning that would prove more prescient than those who dismissed it at the time acknowledged. Australian men, Calwell said, would be fighting the largely indigenous Viet Cong in their own home territory, in the midst of a largely indifferent, if not resentful and frightened population. The observation identified with precision the central problem that would define the next decade of conflict. Not whether Australia or America could defeat the Viet Cong in open battle, but whether any foreign force could establish the kind of territorial and political control that genuine counterinsurgency success required. The military problem Australia inherited in 1965 was substantial. By the time the first Australian boots reached Vietnamese soil, South Vietnam's military situation outside major urban centers had deteriorated to a condition that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, stretched across the length of the country, could not meaningfully address. In Phuoc Tuy Province, which would become the Australian area of operations in 1966, the government controlled Baria and the Vung Tau Special Zone by day. Beyond those enclaves, the Viet Cong collected taxes, recruited fighters, and subjected the rural population to a parallel administration that had been operating, in some areas, since the early 1950s. The enemy that Australia was preparing to fight had been in the territory for years before the first Australian battalion arrived. They knew every path. They knew every village. They knew which families had sons fighting for which side, and which farmers might report a foreign patrol's passing to the nearest cadre. Against this adversary, General William Westmoreland commanded Military Assistance Command Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, with a strategy built on an assumption that seemed reasonable from a certain angle of strategic logic. American firepower was effectively unlimited. North Vietnamese manpower, while substantial, was finite. If attrition could be applied at a sufficient rate, if the body count could be driven high enough and fast enough and sustained long enough, Hanoi would eventually conclude that the cost of continuing exceeded the achievable political objective and accept a negotiated settlement. Multi-battalion search and destroy operations swept through suspected enemy areas behind massive artillery preparation. Boeing B-52. Stratofortress bombers delivered carpet attacks against base camp complexes, each aircraft carrying 30 tons of ordnance capable of devastating areas measured in thousands of square meters. The measure of success that this strategy generated was the body count. Enemy dead tallied after each operation, compiled into theater-wide statistics, and reported up the chain of command as evidence that the attrition mathematics was working. The first major operation that placed Australian and American soldiers in the same jungle demonstrated almost immediately that the mathematics had a flaw. During Operation Hump in November of 1965, the United States 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, was ambushed by a Viet Cong regiment in War Zone D, north of Bien Hoa, losing 49 men killed. In the aftermath, Brigadier General Ellis Williamson reported approximately 400 Viet Cong killed by body count, a figure that he later acknowledged was a guess, produced under pressure from Military Assistance Command Vietnam headquarters that demanded quantifiable results. The body count that became the central metric of American progress in Vietnam had been invented under duress before the war was 6 months old. The implications of that invention would unfold across the next 7 years. From May of 1965, the 1st Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment operated alongside the 173rd Airborne Brigade at Bien Hoa. It was the only multinational combat unit in the war, a tri-national arrangement under Colonel I.R.W. Brumfield's Australian Command attached to Williamson's American formation. The brigade's area of operations covered the Viet Cong base areas of War Zone D, astride the Dong Nai River northeast of the airbase, undulating to hilly terrain covered mainly in jungle where the Viet Cong had operated with impunity for years. Within days of beginning patrol operations, the doctrinal contrast between the two Allied approaches was visible to anyone paying attention, and both sides were paying attention. The 173rd used noise and firepower to draw the enemy to them. When they moved through the jungle, they moved with the presence of a force that expected contact and intended to win it through volume of fire and rapid escalation to heavier support. The Australians moved differently. 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment patrols moved silently, away from roads and tracks, through terrain that most American units would have treated as an obstacle rather than a patrol route. They communicated in whispers. They avoided the paths that offered ease of movement precisely because those paths offered the enemy easy observation of who was using them. Both approaches reflected genuine tactical reasoning. The Americans wanted to force contact on terms that favored their firepower advantage. The Australians wanted to find the enemy before the enemy found them. Each side learned from the other's capabilities. Australian officers absorbed what helicopter mobility and massive artillery support could achieve. American officers observed what happened to enemy activity levels when silent patrolling replaced noisy sweeps. The results of the Australian patrol program were measurable. Enemy activity around Bien Hoa Air Base fell to its lowest recorded level during the 12 months that 1st Battalion operated in the area. In early 1966, the battalion's intelligence-gathering approach to operations contributed directly to uncovering the Cu Chi Tunnel complex, recovering thousands of documents, weapons, and supplies in a single operation. The doctrinal contrast was so clearly evident, and the implications for long-term Australian effectiveness so apparent to both military and political planners, that the conclusion was institutional rather than personal. A single Australian battalion subordinated to an American brigade would always be adapted to American objectives and methods rather than the reverse. If Australian counterinsurgency required independence to function, and the Bien Hoa evidence strongly suggested it did, then Australia needed its own operational ground. Colonel Brumfield presented a genuine boomerang to General Williamson in a gesture that captured something true about the partnership. Genuine mutual respect between forces that had learned from each other while remaining fundamentally different in their approach to the problem before them. By mid-1966, the decision had been made. The 1st Australian Task Force would deploy to Phuoc Tuy Province with its own tactical area of responsibility, its own command structure, and the freedom to develop methods suited to its assessment of the problem, rather than conforming to theater-wide directives designed around American scale and American doctrine. That decision shaped everything that followed. It also had a direct counterpart in American Special Operations, though the connection would not be documented publicly for decades. Chief Warrant Officer Roger Hayden of SEAL Team 1 described the standard operating reality of American Special Operations in Vietnam in terms that made the contrast with Australian methods almost brutally clear. Hayden and his fellow SEALs took over from their predecessors the same day they arrived in country, with no preparation, no handover, and no local knowledge. They flew into a South Vietnamese base camp in the southern Delta region and, in Hayden's words, had no intelligence and nothing to work from. He described their approach to targeting as dartboard operations, selecting locations by throwing a dart at a map, because in the absence of intelligence and accumulated terrain knowledge, one location was as good as another. When Hayden later spent 10 days operating with the Australian Special Air Service in their area of responsibility, his assessment of what he encountered was unequivocal. He told retired SEAL Jocko Willink that he had attended Army Ranger School and Raider School and every other military training establishment the American system offered, and that he learned more about reconnaissance in 10 days with the Australians than in all of them combined. Their field craft, he said, was extraordinary. He noted that the SEAL teams had lost men because their field craft preparation had been inadequate for jungle operations. The Australians had developed something that dartboard operations could never achieve, and the difference between the two approaches was not equipment, not intelligence resources, not firepower. It was knowledge of the ground, built patiently through continuous presence, that made maps a secondary tool rather than a primary dependency. Part of the answer to why Australian methods produced different results lay in what the institution had decided to value before the first patrol left the wire. Silence was a discipline, not a preference. Patience was a doctrine, not a temperament. The map, wherever it was accurate, described terrain. What the Australians built in Phuoc Tuy described the enemy's use of that terrain, which was a different and more operationally decisive form of knowledge entirely. Phuoc Tuy Province presented the arriving Australians with an adversary that had been building exactly that kind of ground knowledge for years before the first Australian boot touched its soil. Senior Colonel Nguyen, the Truyen, commanded the Viet Cong 5th Division from its headquarters in the Mae Tao Mountains in the province's northeast. He was a veteran communist commander who had fought the French through the entire First Indochina War and arrived in Phuoc Tuy with the institutional memory of an insurgency that had been learning how to defeat foreign armies for a generation. His division fielded two main force regiments with substantial combat capability. The 274th Regiment, the stronger and better trained of the two, operated from the Hat Dish area in the province's northwest, with 3 battalions numbering approximately 2,000 men. The 275th Regiment conducted mobile operations across the province with nearly 1,400 personnel. The D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, a local force unit of between 250 and 350 fighters, possessed the kind of intimate terrain knowledge that years of operating in a single province produces. They knew which paths flooded in the wet season, which villages sheltered sympathizers, and which approaches to the provincial towns offered concealment from observation until the last moment. Brigadier Oliver David Jackson arrived in Phuoc Tuy in April of 1966 to command the 1st Australian Task Force during its establishment period through March of 1967. Born in London in 1919, Jackson had graduated from the Royal Military College Duntroon in 1939 and served throughout the Second World War in the Middle East and New Guinea. His experience included Korea from 1952 to 1953 and a posting as Australian military attaché in Washington from 1963 to 1965, a posting that gave him direct knowledge of American military culture and doctrine from the inside. By 1966, he was the only officer to have commanded all 3 original battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment. He brought to Phuoc Tuy a commander's understanding of what counterinsurgency required and what it did not, and he made one of his most consequential decisions in the first weeks of deployment when he ordered the forced resettlement of the villages of Long Tan and Long Phuoc, both within a few kilometers of the proposed base site at Nui Dat. With the agreement of the province chief, their residents were relocated to Dat Do, Long Dien, and Hoa Long without compensation. The reasoning was security-based and operationally sound. Removing the population from the immediate vicinity of the base reduced the Viet Cong's ability to gather intelligence about Australian movements and dispositions. The consequence was political and strategically costly in a different register. The displaced villagers became a source of resentment that Viet Cong political cadres exploited with precision, and for the Viet Cong 5th Division, the loss of these revolutionary villages provided both motivation and pretext for a major demonstration. That demonstration came on the evening of the 16th of August, 1966, when Viet Cong forces used mortars and recoilless rifles to bombard Nui Dat from positions approximately 2 kilometers east of the base. Australian counter-battery fire forced them to cease. The following morning, D Company of the 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment departed to locate the firing positions and determine the withdrawal direction. On the 18th of August, in a rubber plantation near the village of Long Tan, the company encountered a force of regimental strength in prepared positions. What followed tested the discipline and courage of 108 Australian soldiers against an enemy estimated at over 2,000. The battle raged through a monsoon rainstorm that reduced visibility in the rubber plantation to meters and turned the red earth to slippery mud. D Company held its ground under fire that came from multiple directions simultaneously, supported by artillery from the New Zealand 161st Battery, directed with accuracy that brought shells within 30 meters of the Australian position, a margin measured by the difference between the ground they stood on and the ground the enemy occupied. Iroquois helicopters delivered an emergency ammunition resupply through the rain and the fire. Armored personnel carriers fought through flooded creek crossings and enemy ambush groups to reach D Company as darkness fell. When the fighting ended, at least 245 Viet Cong bodies lay across the plantation ground, with evidence indicating that many more dead and wounded had been removed during the night. 18 Australians were killed and 25 wounded, with one dying of wounds in the days that followed. The Battle of Long Tan established something beyond the tactical outcome. It demonstrated that Australian infantry, properly supported, could defeat numerically superior Viet Cong forces in their own environment, and it validated Jackson's decision to base the task force at Nui Dat, despite the proximity to enemy-held territory. The Special Air Service Regiment arrived in Phuoc Tuy to begin building the intelligence architecture that would make every subsequent Australian operation more effective than any operation conducted without it could have been. 3 Squadron reached Vung Tau on the 16th of June, 1966, and moved to Nui Dat the following day. About 120 personnel organized into patrol teams typically operated as groups of 5, a size that balanced the need for firepower against the imperative of stealth in jungle operations, where detection meant tactical failure before the mission could be accomplished. Each patrol carried heavy loads, M16 rifles, at least one M60 machine gun, claymore mines, grenades, and encrypted radio sets for communication with task force headquarters. They inserted by helicopter, often approaching at treetop height, to minimize the time of exposure during which an enemy observer could identify the insertion point. Once on the ground, the patrol would move away from the landing zone immediately, change direction multiple times, and establish a layup position before dark. From that position, the real work began. The Viet Cong came to call them Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle. The name was earned through methods that made conventional infantry operations look conspicuous by comparison. SAS patrols moved at between 100 and 500 meters per day when operating near suspected enemy positions, covering distances that infantry units might traverse in minutes across hours of careful, patient movement. They communicated in hand signals. They lit no fires. They established no pattern of movement that could be predicted by an observer tracking their progress across multiple days. They spent hours in observation positions, watching enemy movement without engaging, recording the information that would guide subsequent infantry operations. The discipline required to remain concealed for days, observing enemy activity without initiating contact, demanded professional patience that most soldiers never develop. The recognition that watching and reporting sometimes delivers more tactical value than shooting. The techniques that enabled this drew on Aboriginal tracking methods absorbed during earlier service in Australia and adapted through the Malayan emergency of 1948 to 1960, where Australian officers had worked with Indigenous trackers and built skills in reading ground sign that transcended standard infantry training. A bent branch told a story about who had passed and how recently. Disturbed soil in a footprint indicated direction and load. The pattern of freshness in broken vegetation across a trail network revealed which routes were actively used and which had been abandoned as primary thoroughfares in favor of alternatives. SAS patrols could determine from subtle environmental evidence what no map could show, not the terrain as it existed in theory, but the terrain as it was being used. By whom, in what numbers, and on what schedule. This accumulated knowledge, compiled over weeks and months and transmitted back to task force intelligence officers, created the foundation for every major infantry operation the Australians would conduct in Puak Tui for the next 5 years. 1967 tested the limits of what Australian forces could achieve with and without that foundation. Operation Bribie in February of that year saw 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment engage elements of the D445 Battalion near Ap Mai An in fighting that produced the task force's highest casualties since Long Tan, a result that reflected the difficulty of conventional infantry operations against an enemy who chose the ground, chose the timing, and understood the terrain better than any newcomer could. The Battle of Suoi Chau Pha on the 6th of August. 1967 saw a company of 7th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment clash with a reinforced Viet Cong company during Operation Ballarat in the Hat Dish area, a close-quarters encounter battle in dense jungle during monsoon rain, where both sides suffered heavy casualties with neither able to gain decisive advantage. The pattern of these engagements reinforced what patient SAS reconnaissance could prevent. When intelligence identified enemy dispositions before contact, Australian infantry operated from a position of knowledge that consistently produced favorable outcomes. When contact was initiated by a well-positioned enemy on ground of their choosing, outcomes were less predictable. By late 1967, Brigadier Stuart Graham speculated that the Viet Cong may have fled the province altogether, perhaps pushed into border areas by the sustained pressure of Australian operations. It was an optimistic assessment. It would be disproven with violence within weeks. The war that was being fought in the rest of South Vietnam during these years followed a different logic than the one developing in Phuoc Tuy. And the difference mattered because the American logic was the dominant one, the one that received the resources, the political attention, and the institutional weight of the world's most powerful military. Westmoreland's attrition strategy rested on an assumption that seemed quantifiable. If American firepower could kill enemy soldiers faster than North Vietnam could replace them, the arithmetic would eventually force a political accommodation. Multi-battalion search and destroy operations swept through province after province. Supported by tactical airstrikes and pre-assault artillery preparations that reduced suspected enemy positions to cratered earth before the infantry arrived. Operation Masher in Binh Dinh Province in early 1966 generated 125,000 refugees and a body count of 750 Viet Cong killed by official tallies. Within 4 months, Viet Cong units had returned to the province and resumed operations at levels comparable to before the sweep began. The pattern repeated. American forces would enter an area, inflict casualties, and withdraw to conduct operations elsewhere, according to plans that emphasized maintaining offensive momentum across the theater. The Viet Cong, demonstrating the tactical flexibility of forces fighting on familiar ground, would avoid battle wherever conditions disfavored them, and wait. By 1967, despite American deployments that had grown to over 400,000 personnel, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces initiated approximately 90% of large firefights, retaining the strategic initiative that allowed them to choose when and where to engage, regardless of American firepower superiority. The paradox of overwhelming material advantage combined with persistent tactical disadvantage revealed a fundamental problem with the attrition strategy that statistics were beginning to make undeniable. The body count, whatever its validity as a measure of enemy casualties, was not translating into the reduction of enemy capability that the theory required. Westmoreland addressed this gap by pressing his allies to adopt similar methods. His complaints to Major General Tim Vincent, Commander Australian Forces Vietnam, were direct. The Australian emphasis on patrolling, on searching villages without destroying them, on establishing ambushes and developing detailed intelligence rather than conducting massive sweeps, appeared insufficiently aggressive by American standards. The phrase that entered the record to describe what Westmoreland considered adequate operations was brazen scrub bashing, capturing the American view that volume of effort demonstrated commitment and produced results. Australian battalion commanders viewed the body count with explicit contempt as a measure of effectiveness in counterinsurgency. Their measures tracked whether the enemy retained freedom of movement, whether villages were being separated from Viet Cong influence, whether security was developing in ways that might eventually be transferred to South Vietnamese forces. Harder to count, more meaningful in the context of an insurgency that would not end simply because enough of its fighters had been killed. The Australian institutional foundation for this different approach came from the Malayan Emergency, a counterinsurgency campaign that British Commonwealth forces, including Australians, had prosecuted from 1948 to 1960 and won through patient application of principles that emphasized population security over enemy destruction. Australian officers who had served in Malaya brought that institutional memory to Vietnam, adapted it to different terrain, different enemy, and different political context, and applied it with the benefit of a command structure that gave them the freedom to do so. American forces, whose recent institutional experience centered on Korea and preparation for large-scale conventional conflict in Europe, carried no equivalent memory of successful counterinsurgency from which to draw. The contrast was not one of individual competence, but of institutional foundation. One army had a template that worked, and the other was still searching for one. Then the Tet Offensive arrived and changed the operational context for everyone. On the 31st of January, 1968, between 85,000 and 100,000 People's Army and Viet Cong troops simultaneously attacked more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. The scale of the offensive was a military disaster for the Communists in terms of casualties. The losses sustained during Tet and its aftermath decimated Viet Cong main force units that had taken years to build. But the psychological impact was catastrophic for American public confidence in a war that official sources had been describing as moving steadily toward victory. The contrast between the optimistic assessments of American progress and the reality of enemy forces fighting in the grounds of the United States Embassy in Saigon was a gap that official reassurances could not bridge. Prime Minister John Gorton in Australia announced that Australia would not increase its military commitment beyond its current level of approximately 8,000 personnel. The war continued regardless. For the 1st Australian Task Force, Tet had an immediate operational consequence. The growing threat had prompted Lieutenant General Frederick Wyand, commanding 3rd Corps Tactical Zone, to request the use of the task force outside its Phuoc Tuy base to help defend the vital Long Binh and Bien Hoa complex northeast of Saigon. The Australians had agreed with the condition that 1 battalion remain at Nui Dat to secure it. Operation Coburg, from the 24th of January to the 1st of March, 1968, deployed task force headquarters under Brigadier Ron Hughes into unfamiliar territory between Bien Hoa and Long Con provinces, the first time the Australians had operated outside their tactical area of responsibility. 17 Australians were killed and 61 wounded through the operation in a series of sharp engagements against Viet Cong units attacking Bien Hoa province towns. It established a precedent. The task force could operate in American-controlled territory in terrain it had not previously patrolled, and maintain tactical effectiveness. That precedent would be tested far more severely 3 months later. In mid-April of 1968, 2nd Field Force received intelligence from defectors and captured prisoners indicating that a second major communist offensive against Saigon would strike within weeks. Weyand expanded the security operations around the capital into a counteroffensive designated Operation Ton Thang 1, Total Victory, involving nearly every combat unit in 3rd Corps. Major General A.L. MacDonald, the senior Australian commander in Vietnam, instructed his liaison officer at 2nd Field Force headquarters to find a more aggressive role for the task force. On the 21st of April, the Australians deployed to the Hat Ditch area on the Phuoc Tuy and Bien Hoa border, expecting to engage Viet Cong units in the area. When the communist offensive began on the 4th of May and moved against Saigon with its main axis running through Bien Hoa province, the task force shifted north. 2 Australian infantry battalions, 1st and 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, with supporting arms, were redeployed into Area of Operations Columbus 3, a region the Australians had never operated in before, east of Xuan Loc and south of Highway 1. The maps they received for this unfamiliar territory were pictomaps, aerial photography with grid lines superimposed, described by a New Zealand artillery forward observer attached to the operation as not accurate enough for detail work. The orders circulating at company level were largely verbal. What official orders existed were not seen by the officers who would need to execute them. On the 12th of May, 1968, the occupation of Fire Support Base Coral began. The location had been selected from maps and aerial photography without prior ground reconnaissance. When B Company 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, under Major Bert Irwin, moved to secure the designated landing zone, they found a field of rubber saplings, approximately 2 meters tall, that required clearing by hand with machetes before the helicopters could bring in men and equipment. The airlift plan never recovered from the delay. Aircraft assigned to the fly-in were diverted to other tasks and returned intermittently, rather than in the organized sequence the plan required. Irwin asked for the fire support base site to be relocated to nearby ground that was demonstrably clearer and more suitable for the defensive positions the garrison would need. The request was refused. Through the afternoon and into the evening, the task force was still flying in. Elements from multiple units, rifle companies, artillery batteries, engineers, and headquarters staff arrived in a sequence that bore little relationship to the defensive priorities that a position expecting enemy attention required. By nightfall on the 12th of May, FSB Coral's defenses were incomplete. Positions that should have been dug were not dug. Wire that should have been laid was not laid. The garrison was under strength, and its components had not yet fully oriented to the ground they were supposed to defend. North Vietnamese observers had watched the helicopter activity all day. The flurry of Iroquois movements, carrying men and equipment in and out of a position in sensitive territory north of Bien Hoa, had been tracked. Scouts had moved into the area before the Australians arrived. An American officer familiar with the operational area, observing the activity around Coral, offered a warning to arriving Australian officers that combined professional assessment with a certain grim hospitality. "You won't need to find Charlie," he said. "They'll come looking for you." Among the young officers present at Coral that evening was 2nd Lieutenant Tim Fisher of 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, then 20 years old. Fisher would be wounded in the fighting that followed. Nearly 3 decades later, he would serve as Deputy Prime Minister of Australia from 1996 to 1999. The battle that American theater commanders regarded as a supporting operation, the largest engagement of Australia's Vietnam deployment, would leave a mark on the political character of a future national leader that the soldiers digging their incomplete positions on the evening of the 12th of May could not have anticipated. The barrage came first. At 3:30 in the morning on the 13th of May, 1968, a brief but intense barrage of rocket and mortar fire struck FSB Coral. It lasted only minutes. What followed it was worse. Infantry from a regiment of the North Vietnamese People's Army advanced on the base in the darkness, moving through positions that were supposed to have been wire-protected and fully manned, but were not. The mortar platoon, positioned to provide fire support across the base perimeter, was overrun. 2 gun positions belonging to 102 Field Battery were attacked at close quarters by PAVN infantry, who had reached the gun line before the crews fully understood what was happening. For the first time since the Second World War, Australian artillerymen were fighting in close defense of their own guns. Number 6 gun of 102 Field Battery was overrun, with PAVN soldiers among the gun's crew positions and the weapon briefly in enemy hands. Number 4 gun kept firing high explosive over open sights directly into the advancing infantry, its crew working a weapon designed for indirect support fire as though it were a point-blank defensive weapon, which at that moment it was. The artillerymen, who had trained for years to deliver fire support from protected positions, found themselves fighting as infantry in the darkness of a position they had been digging for less than 12 hours, with defenses that were incomplete and an enemy already inside them. Other guns raised their sights and continued firing in support of the infantry companies deployed in ambush positions up to 4 kilometers outside the base perimeter. Those companies still engaged in their own fighting in the darkness around Coral's outer edges. Lieutenant Tony Jensen commanded the mortar platoon at the moment it was most desperately needed. With PAVN infantry among his positions and annihilation threatening, Jensen called for Splintex rounds to be fired onto his own location, anti-personnel cannon rounds containing approximately 700 steel darts behind a curved explosive charge, capable of cutting through anything in their path. The mortarmen pressed their faces into the earth of their positions. The rounds swept overhead at centimeters of clearance. When Jensen raised his head, the ground around his position was covered with North Vietnamese dead. The attack had been stopped not by weight of position or depth of defense, but by the trained decision of a lieutenant who understood precisely what his weapons could do and was willing to be under them when they did it. Bombardier Andrew Forsdyke, of 102 Field Battery, later described the experience as fighting in the clammy tropical darkness in what he considered one of the toughest tests the Australian force would face in the entire war. The noise, the darkness, the close quarters, the confusion of a position that had never been properly organized, encountering a well-planned assault. All the conditions under which formal planning becomes irrelevant, and training becomes the only thing that matters. At dawn, when the first attack had been repelled after more than 2 hours of fighting, 11 Australians lay dead and 28 were wounded. The bodies of North Vietnamese soldiers were found not beyond the wire and not in the approaches to the base, but within the Australian positions themselves. Evidence of how close the first attack had come to succeeding and how narrow the margin had been between survival and annihilation. Number 6 gun was recaptured before the sun rose. The Australians took it back the same way the PAVN had taken it, at close quarters, in darkness, by men who had no map for what they were doing and needed none. The 14th of May brought a change of command that might, in different circumstances, have destabilized a force that had just survived its worst night of the war. Brigadier Ron Hughes departed on previously scheduled leave, and command of the 1st Australian Task Force passed to his deputy, Colonel Donald Dunstan, described by an officer who served under him as a well-experienced, no-nonsense soldier of good reputation and confident manner. The transition occurred without crisis. Dunstan, who would subsequently rise to become Chief of Army in Australia, took command of a task force that had survived its first test at Coral, was preparing for the second, and was simultaneously pushing rifle companies into ambush operations in the surrounding area. The institutional depth that produced officers capable of that transition in those circumstances was not an accident of personnel selection. It was the product of the same professional culture that built SAS patrols who could operate for weeks in silence. The second attack on FSB Coral came on the night of the 15th to 16th of May. 3 PAVN battalions advanced behind a heavy mortar barrage, and this time the assault was larger, better coordinated, and aimed at objectives the first attack had identified. Part of the A Company position was occupied for a period, with North Vietnamese soldiers in the Australian lines, and the perimeter temporarily breached in one sector while fighting continued in every other. The defense held through 4 hours of fighting that involved 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment Infantry, armored personnel carriers of a Squadron 3rd Cavalry Regiment, the guns of the American 235th Artillery, also at Coral, American helicopter gunships, and C-47 aircraft equipped with flares and miniguns. These were the aircraft the soldiers called spookies, orbiting overhead and pouring fire into the forming lines of enemy advancing across ground, lit intermittently by parachute flares. When the second attack ended, 5 more Australians were dead and 19 were wounded. Only 34 North Vietnamese bodies were recovered from the position, but the blood trails and drag marks that led from the base perimeter into the surrounding darkness indicated that many more dead and wounded had been removed during the fighting. The 235th Artillery's presence at Coral represented something worth noting. The 2nd Battalion of the 35th Artillery, nicknamed the Huskies, had the distinction of being the only American unit in the entire war to serve as a regular, integral component of a foreign combat force. Assigned to the task force on a rotating battery basis from May of 1966 onward, they had been working alongside the Australians for nearly 2 years by the time of Coral Balmoral. Their integration, providing the 155mm medium artillery that augmented the Australian 105mm howitzers, had produced, in the language of official assessment, excellent results. At Coral, under attack in the darkness, the combined fires of Australian and American artillery functioned as the unified system 2 years of working together had made them. On the 22nd of May, when another rocket and mortar barrage struck Coral, the Australians' own mortars opened fire on the forming Pavna Salt and dispersed it before the infantry could close. The base that had nearly been overrun 9 days earlier was now detecting and breaking up attacks before they reached the wire. The learning curve had been compressed into days of the most effective kind of instruction available. On the 24th of May, 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment moved 4.5 kilometers north of Coral to establish a second fire support base, FSB Balmoral, deeper into North Vietnamese operational territory than any previous Australian position. The logic was consistent with the task force's established approach. Position yourself where the enemy cannot ignore you and engage him on terms that require him to come to a position he has not chosen. It was the same reasoning that had placed Nui Dat in the center of Viet Cong territory in 1966, and it produced a similar result. The Centurion tanks of C Squadron 1st Armored Regiment had been making their way from Nui Dat to the operational area since the decision to reinforce Coral had been made. The road march was a logistics undertaking, heavy tanks covering substantial distance over roads that were not designed for them, arriving at Coral 2 days before the major attack on Balmoral and providing the armored capability that would prove decisive. Australian infantry who had carried initial reservations about the value of tank support in jungle and counterinsurgency operations were about to have those reservations permanently revised. Rocket-propelled grenades that devastated the M113 armored personnel carriers used by both Australian and American forces were largely ineffective against Centurion armor, a material advantage that translated directly into tactical freedom of action when the tanks moved with infantry against prepared positions. Lieutenant Mick Butler commanded the tank troop that moved cross-country to reinforce Balmoral on the 25th of May. B Company, 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, provided infantry screen for the column, with platoons at the front and rear. Progress was steady until a flurry of shots from the forward scouts indicated an ambush at the edge of a box of jungle approximately 1 kilometer across. Butler committed 2 tanks to fire support, while the other 2 attacked with the infantry in a quick right flank assault. Sergeant Len Allen's tank killed a North Vietnamese soldier, attempting to flee at a distance of 30 meters with a burst of canister. The column had no casualties and pressed on to Balmoral. The episode was, in the context of what the next 24 hours would bring, a brief engagement. It illustrated the combined arms confidence that the Australians brought to unfamiliar terrain. Contact, immediate tactical decision, execution, continuation. The first major attack on FSB Balmoral came on the night of the 25th to 26th of May. A PAVN battalion struck the position with an opening barrage described by Major Peter Phillips, commanding D Company 3rd Battalion, as terribly accurate. Scouts had previously entered the area with lengths of string to measure exact distances from reference points to the Australian positions, ensuring that the mortars would find their targets in the darkness with a precision that their earlier attacks on Coral had lacked. Assault waves of North Vietnamese infantry hit D Company's perimeter behind that barrage, and for a period, the outcome of the attack was genuinely uncertain. What decided it was the combination that Butler's march had confirmed. Infantry discipline holding the perimeter, supported by 2 Centurion tanks sighted directly on the primary enemy approach, firing canister rounds and machine gun fire into the assault as it developed. At least 42 North Vietnamese were killed and 7 prisoners taken. A simultaneous attack on Coral failed. The pattern of the fighting was establishing itself. Australian positions that could not be bypassed, that had to be attacked directly, held by soldiers whose training had prepared them for exactly this kind of fighting, in exactly these conditions of darkness and proximity and chaos. On the 27th of May, General William Westmoreland flew to FSB Balmoral. He examined the Centurion tanks, including the vehicle commanded by Corporal Trevor Lowe. He spoke with D Company. After approximately 30 minutes, he departed. Westmoreland had formally complained to Vincent months earlier that Australian methods were insufficiently aggressive. He had personally flown to the position of the battalion he had criticized in order to observe its performance under fire in an American area of operations, on ground the Australians had never previously patrolled, with maps their own officers had described as inadequate for detailed work. The juxtaposition did not require editorial comment. A second assault on Balmoral came on the night of the 27th to 28th of May. The defense held again, with the attacking regiment losing at least 42 killed and 7 prisoners. Figures that, as at every engagement during Coral Balmoral, were considered significant undercounts given the evidence of drag marks leading from the battlefield into the surrounding jungle. D Company 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment subsequently moved out from Coral with 4 Centurion tanks to clear the bunker complex that Butler's column had encountered on its approach march. Australian intelligence had assessed that contact as the edge of an extensive system. That assessment proved accurate. The offensive action, moving from a base that had survived 2 major attacks to destroy the infrastructure supporting those attacks, reflected the task force philosophy that passive defense was never the objective. Security required active pressure, sustained activity, and the willingness to take the fight to the enemy's prepared positions rather than wait for him to bring it to yours. When the Battle of Coral Balmoral concluded on the 6th of June, 1968, the North Vietnamese forces that had planned a second major assault on Saigon had been forced to postpone that offensive. The Australian task force had killed over 300 North Vietnamese soldiers and captured hundreds of weapons. 26 Australians were dead, 2 from 12 Field Regiment, 1 from 104 Signal Squadron, 16 from 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, 6 from 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, and 1 from 161st Independent Reconnaissance Squadron. Over 100 Australians were wounded. The ground had been somebody else's. The maps had been inadequate. The orders had been verbal. The defenses had been incomplete on the first night. None of it had prevented the result that training and doctrine and institutional memory produced when tested under the conditions they had been built to meet. George Hulse, the 21-year-old lieutenant commanding 1st Field Squadron Royal Australian Engineers, who had occupied almost a third of the Coral perimeter with his engineers and helped repel the human wave attacks of the 16th of May, later described the moment of decision that passed between the men around him. They had looked at each other, he said, and agreed without formal deliberation. They would fight and live, or they would fight and die. There was no third option, and they had all understood this simultaneously, which told something about the kind of soldiers the Australian system had built. 1st Australian Task Force returned to Phuoc Tuy, carrying what Coral Balmoral had confirmed, that the darkness was theirs if they claimed it systematically, and that systematic was a standard they could maintain in terrain they had never seen before, as readily as in terrain they had spent years learning. Major Reginald Beasley took command of 3 SAS Squadron in February of 1969 for its second tour in Phuoc Tuy, bringing with him a command philosophy that articulated the regiment's intelligence mission with a physical gesture that made his priorities unmistakable. The kills boards that previous squadrons had erected, physical displays tracking enemy casualties accumulated during patrols, he kicked down. Not because casualties were irrelevant, but because tracking them as the primary measure of patrol success oriented the entire squadron towards seeking contact rather than avoiding it, and contact was what happened when reconnaissance failed. The patrol that returned, having located a PAVN logistics route, documented its usage patterns, and withdrawn without being detected, had delivered more operational value than the patrol that initiated contact and killed 3 soldiers before extracting under fire. Beasley's priorities were the regiment's priorities made explicit: find, fix, and report, and let the infantry battalions do what infantry battalions are designed to do once the intelligence has been handed to them. Under Beasley's command, 3 Squadron focused extensively on operations around the Mae Tao Mountains in the province's northeast. The Viet Cong secure base areas beyond artillery range from Nui Dat, where Senior Colonel Truyen's division maintained the sanctuary from which it could sustain operations throughout Phuoc Tuy without immediate risk of fire support retaliation. The SAS task was to find the movement routes, map the supply patterns, and hand that information to the infantry battalions that could do something about it. In October of 1969, Sergeant Chris Roberts led a 3 Squadron patrol operating near the Courtenay rubber plantation when his team made contact with Viet Cong near a bunker system. Rain an hour before the contact had soaked his primary radio, making normal communication with Task Force headquarters impossible. Roberts used his VHF set, whispering into the handset, to reach aircraft flying over Phuoc Tuy on a frequency called Nui.RT that was monitored for emergency communications. He reached a pilot, the contact was managed, and the patrol extracted. Beasley subsequently sent Roberts as liaison officer to the 18th ARVN Division and later to the 199th American Light Infantry Brigade to broaden his operational perspective. At the American Brigade, Roberts observed what he described as quite a difference in the way Australians and Americans operated, differences that extended beyond tactical procedures to the fundamental assumptions about what information was required before committing soldiers to a course of action, and how much uncertainty was acceptable once they were committed. The sustained offensive that the task force mounted from September of 1969 through April of 1970 represented the culmination of 4 years of patient intelligence gathering, methodical pressure, and the systematic denial of operational freedom that the SAS reconnaissance program had been building toward. Multiple battalions conducted simultaneous operations across Phuoc Tuy, maintaining continuous pressure that denied Viet Cong forces the recovery periods that had previously allowed them to rebuild capability between engagements. By April of 1970, the bulk of enemy main force units had withdrawn from the province. They had not been destroyed in a decisive battle. They had been made unable to sustain operations through cumulative pressure that left them no safe period and no reliable supply. The distinction mattered. Viet Cong forces defeated in a major engagement could rebuild given time and sanctuary. Forces denied the sustained logistical support that jungle operations required could not continue to function, regardless of their tactical capability. The withdrawal of main force units created a vulnerability that Australian intelligence officers recognized and moved to exploit. Local guerrilla forces remaining in the province could not sustain themselves in jungle-based areas without regular access to food supplies from sympathetic villages. Main force units had been able to preposition food stocks along intended routes of advance, but local forces could not operate on those margins. They needed to visit villages every 3 to 5 days, depending on the size of the unit and the amount it required. Those visits happened at night, for obvious reasons, along established trails and paths that offered concealment from observation. The movements followed predictable timing cycles. Statistical analysis of SAS patrol reports and other intelligence sources documented that enemy activity peaked at around 8 o'clock in the evening as supply parties entered villages to begin collection, with a secondary peak in the pre-dawn hours between 4 and 5 in the morning as they departed to return to jungle positions before daylight. Intelligence officers who understood that pattern held, in effect, the enemy's operational schedule. Operation Phoi Hop, from the 7th to the 18th of April, 1970, implemented the concept that this intelligence made possible. The 8th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment conducted close ambushing around the villages of Hoa Long, Ap Suy Ngay, Duc Mai, and Bin Ba with infantry companies occupying positions on approach routes within 2.5 kilometers of target villages, and maintaining them continuously throughout the operation, rather than conducting brief sweeps and withdrawing. The objective, stated explicitly in operation orders, was to deny the enemy access into the villages rather than to maximize enemy casualties through large engagements. Operational summaries described it as an entirely new concept of operations for the 1st Australian Task Force. It concluded on the 18th of April with a cordon and search of Apbak hamlet within Hoa Long village to apprehend suspects and gather intelligence. The result: 11 Viet Cong killed, no Australian casualties. The operation's aim was stated as achieved, without qualification. By the standards that Westmoreland had applied to Allied operations, the body count was modest. By the standards that the task force had been applying since Bien Hoa in 1965, it was decisive, because the 11 killed demonstrated that infiltrating supply parties into sympathetic villages now came at a lethal cost that made the resupply missions operationally unsustainable. And the absence of Australian casualties demonstrated that the ambush positions had been correctly placed and correctly executed. On the 12th of August, 1970, 8 platoon of C Company established an ambush position near Hoa Long village, based on intelligence about movement patterns that months of sustained observation had established as reliable. A Viet Cong supply party departing the village after collecting provisions walked into the kill zone in the pre-dawn hours. 9 Viet Cong were killed and 5 captured. The prisoners provided intelligence that refined subsequent targeting. The enemy had no safe window remaining. Not at 8 in the evening when the patrols entered, not in the pre-dawn hours when they departed, not on any route that the comprehensive ambush coverage had not already identified and occupied. The systematic nature of the Australian operations had progressively eliminated every option that Viet Cong forces had previously relied upon, and there were no new options available in terrain where Australian patrol knowledge had become more detailed than the enemy's own. The 5 years of SAS operations across Phuoc Tuy produced a statistical record that documented what patient, intelligence-led, small unit operations could achieve when applied with consistency and professional discipline over an extended period. 580 men served in the regiment squadrons across 6 tour rotations. They conducted nearly 1,200 patrols covering the length and breadth of the province and extending into adjacent areas when operations required. In 298 contacts with Viet Cong forces, they accounted for 492 confirmed enemy killed, 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, and 11 prisoners captured according to official records. SAS losses totaled 1 soldier killed in action, 1 who died of wounds, 3 killed in accidents, 1 missing in action whose remains would not be found until August of 2008, and 1 death from illness. 28 men were wounded. The kill ratio exceeded 30-1, the highest recorded by any unit on any side in the entire Vietnam War. The intelligence those patrols generated guided every major infantry operation in the province, making the infantry far more effective than random sweeps could have been, and creating a cycle of surveillance, targeting, and engagement that drove enemy capability steadily downward across the period. On the 18th of August, 1971, Prime Minister William McMahon announced that the 1st Australian Task Force would cease operations in October and commence phased withdrawal. The last SAS patrol in Vietnam lasted 5 days, from the 1st through the 5th of October, 1971, and made no contact with enemy forces in a province that had become quiet. The quiet was what 5 years of systematic work had built. 2 Squadron, which had conducted the final tour, disbanded on return to Australia as the regiment contracted to peacetime strength. The last patrol returned without incident, without drama, without a shot fired, which was, in the metrics that had mattered since Major Beasley kicked down the kills boards, the most complete possible statement of what the patrols had achieved. The statistics compiled over those 5 years documented something extraordinary. They also documented something insufficient. When the 1st Australian Task Force withdrew, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam proved unable to maintain the ambush patterns, the patrol density, and the intelligence cycle that had silenced the province. The security that 5 years of sustained Australian pressure had established was not transferable to forces that lacked the training depth, the command culture, and the institutional patience that Australian operations had required. Viet Cong forces that had been reduced to token presence in Phuoc Tuy gradually returned as South Vietnamese army units failed to maintain what the Australians had built. The village networks that had been severed through years of systematic effort reverted when the pressure ceased. The province, like most of South Vietnam, fell when North Vietnamese forces launched their final offensive in the spring of 1975, following the withdrawal of American support and the collapse of South Vietnamese military resistance. The failure to prevent that outcome raises a question that American officers had been asking in various forms since Bien Hoa in 1965. If the Australian approach was demonstrably more effective at establishing durable security in a counterinsurgency environment, why did it not become the model for American operations across South Vietnam? The answer lay in several realities that were structural rather than doctrinal. The 1st Australian Task Force could concentrate its entire effort on a single province of approximately 1,000 square miles, with 8,000 personnel who could traverse it in hours. American forces faced responsibility for the security of a country measured in tens of thousands of square miles, with an enemy operating across every province. Replicating the task force's patrol density and intelligence depth across the entirety of South Vietnam would have required force levels that no American mobilization could sustain politically or economically. The mathematics did not work. Beyond the mathematics, the institutional culture that produced Australian results had been built over decades of professional training and operational experience that could not be transferred by issuing new orders or adopting new tactics. Doctrine can be written in weeks. The professional judgment required to execute it at the level the SAS demonstrated takes years to develop and cannot be manufactured at scale on a conscript timeline. Doctrine compounded the structural barrier. Westmoreland's strategy produced body counts that could be reported to political leaders and the American public as evidence of measurable progress. Population security denied enemy operational freedom, severed supply networks. These were harder to count and harder to explain to audiences demanding clear metrics of advancement toward victory. The institutional pressure to generate quantifiable results created a systematic preference for operations that produce numbers over operations that produce the quieter, harder to document effects that genuine counterinsurgency required. And the training pipeline that produced the SAS soldiers who built those results. Selection and patrol course and operational deployment across a professional career could not be replicated at scale by a conscription-based military rotating 12-month tours through a theater where continuity of local knowledge mattered more than any other single factor. The SAS trooper, who had spent years developing fieldcraft and had served multiple tours in the same province, carried knowledge that no map contained. The conscript on his first 6-month operational rotation, working from whatever maps were available, was starting from a different position entirely. Roger Hayden's account, preserved through his conversation with Jocko Willink and transmitted to an audience of contemporary military professionals through a podcast that reached millions, introduced the Australian SAS Vietnam experience to a generation of American Special Operations personnel who had not encountered it through official channels. The best he had ever seen. His 10 days of silence in the jungle, learning by observation what training schools had not taught him, became a kind of transmission. The fieldcraft that Aboriginal trackers had taught to Australian soldiers in an earlier era, adapted through Malaya, developed through 5 years in Puak Tui, passed through a SEAL's experience into the professional culture of 21st century Special Operations Forces. Modern counterinsurgency doctrine, developed through hard experience in Iraq and Afghanistan across the 2000s, reached conclusions about pattern of life intelligence, small unit presence, and population-focused security that Australian forces in Puak Tui province had validated empirically in the 1960s and documented in operational records that academic researchers would later confirm with statistical rigor. University of New South Wales research, mapping thousands of combat incidents across the deployment, confirmed 9 successful Australian engagements for every 10 contacts, and confirmed that the village ambush operations of 1969 and 70 produced sustained reductions in enemy capability, that large-scale search and destroy operations, consuming far greater resources, had consistently failed to achieve. The numbers said what the veterans had known. The approach worked. What maps could not document, it turned out, could still be measured when enough time had passed. The soldiers who walked those nearly 1,200 patrols, who whispered into emergency radio frequencies with wet primary radios in contact with the enemy, who pressed their faces into Vietnamese earth as Splintex rounds swept centimeters overhead, who spent 10-day operations in complete silence, reading bent branches and disturbed footprints in jungle that no map described accurately. They understood something that the entire experience of the Australian deployment in Vietnam had proven, and that the subsequent decades of counterinsurgency across multiple theaters continued to confirm. Terrain is information. Silence is an advantage. Patience is a weapon. The jungle yields its intelligence not to firepower, but to time, to observation, and to the discipline to become part of it, rather than announce your presence through it. These were not insights that could be transmitted in a briefing or captured in a tactical manual. They were the accumulated product of an institutional culture that had decided, years before Vietnam, that the soldier who knew the ground was more dangerous than the soldier who merely occupied it. What 10 days taught Roger Hayden. 5 years and 26 dead at Coral Balmoral wrote permanently into the record of military achievement. What that record shows is not a story about maps or the lack of them. It is a story about what soldiers become when their training is built from the ground up, when their doctrine is adapted from accumulated experience rather than imposed from theoretical preference, and when their commanders are given the independence to apply that doctrine according to their own assessment of the problem rather than someone else's metrics. The Australians who held FSB Coral on the night of the 13th of May, 1968, did not hold it because the situation was manageable. They held it because their training had prepared them for situations that were not manageable, and they had learned to keep working in the dark. In the jungle, in the darkness, in somebody else's area of operations with somebody else's inadequate maps, what decides the outcome is not what you carry into the dark. It is what you know when you get there.